we still own more than 70% of West Jerusalem, by the way, that Israel declared as its capital. Whether private property or church property or awqaf property, this is still, we still own it. But in order to discuss the status of Jerusalem, we must discuss both East and West Jerusalem. If we're going to change it from UN resolutions 181 and 194, it means we have to discuss both sides of Jerusalem, and we have to come to an understanding that this one city has to become two capitals for two states. That religious affiliation does not give you claim to sovereignty. And that, on the contrary, Jerusalem must be demystified. We must deal with it as a terrestrial city, not a celestial city. It is subject to international law, legality, and, of course, political compromise. East Jerusalem must not be besieged with settlements. There are three rings around Jerusalem. The settlements and the checkpoints, military siege, and of course now the wall. That is, all of these are extracting East Jerusalem from its Palestinian context, from its Palestinian environment. The integrity and authenticity of its own history and culture, of its own identity, must be safeguarded. And of course, the population of Jerusalem, Palestinian population, and the continuity. Because Jerusalem has always been a city greater than itself. And I wrote this in the Madrid speech. It must not be subject to greed or to acquisition, but must become a genuine symbol of peace, coexistence, and harmony. In that context as well, settlements are a violation of international law, international humanitarian law, the Fourth Geneva Convention, and of course have become an expression of expansionism, territorial acquisition, and demographic imposition. There's a spurious narrative there for the settlers and the settlement. It's a superimposition of a false grid and infrastructure on Palestinian territory, on Palestinian realities, that is attempting to marginalize the authentic Palestinian reality. If you look at the roads now that are being built in the West Bank, what we call the apartheid, the racist roads, they take away our land, they confiscate Palestinian land, and then they build roads to connect the settlements to each other and to marginalize the Palestinian towns, cities, and villages. And these roads are purely for the settlers. So we cannot even use the roads that were built on our own land. But they connect the settlements to each other. Only settlers can use it. And they connect the settlements to Israel. So they become an infrastructure that expresses Israeli extraterritoriality. And that expresses, of course, the intentions of annexation and expansion of Israel. And they've created, in this sense, an apartheid condition in the West Bank, along with the wall. I don't know how many of you have seen the wall or seen pictures of the wall of separation and annexation. The worst thing about the wall is not that it is built on our land. I mean, if you want to build walls, you all know that walls are historical failures, aren't they? From China to Berlin, walls have never succeeded in preventing or resolving conflicts or wars. But even if you suffer from that mentality and you build a wall, you cannot build it on other people's lands. You build it on your own land. But at the same time, if you build that wall, you are not only robbing the Palestinians, of our horizon and of our vision, you are also robbing the Israelis of their horizon and their vision. People who live behind walls develop closed mentalities, beleaguered, besieged mentalities. This is not something that I want for the Palestinians or for the Israelis for the future. This is a preparation of future conflict, hostility, and so on. It's not just that the wall is ugly, it's also that it robs both peoples of the necessary need to communicate, to see each other, and of course to see the horizon and the sunlight. And of course, we have the International Court of Justice ruling. I'm sure you've heard of it. It's an advisory ruling about the wall, that it should be removed and that people should be compensated and that all countries must do whatever possible in order to bring Israel to compliance. So far, nothing has done. But in any negotiations, we cannot give retroactive legality or legitimacy to settlements in the same way as we cannot accept the wall. This must be part of what I call the devolution of occupation and evolution of statehood, these two that must proceed simultaneously. Not ironically the reversal, the opposite, as is happening now on the ground. We have the occupation reinventing itself, evolving into a new system of control without responsibility. And we have Palestinian statehood undergoing devolution in the form of deconstruction and aggression. So the process that we needed was one of devolution of occupation and evolution of statehood, not the other way around, evolution of occupation into new means of control and security, and devolution of Palestinian statehood through economic strangulation, through the siege, through the total dismantlement of institutions. What must be deconstructed now is the narrative of occupation, not Palestinian realities, economic, territorial, historical, and human realities, nor the substitution of the demographic, geographic, historical, and cultural narrative of Palestine, as Ilan Pape said. In 1991, when we went to the Madrid talks, I'm not going back in history, but just to remind you, there was a real change in the course of history from inevitable continued conflict and confrontation to the promise and potential of peace and reconciliation for both peoples. And this was an act of positive intervention that came as a result of self-confidence. Because believe me, the myth that people make peace as a result of exhaustion, as a result of despair, is a myth. Only the strong and the confident can make peace. It takes tremendous courage to commit to a peaceful resolution to conflict. It takes a great deal of cowardice to immediately resort to military means and to military control and oppression. We've attempted the shift from mutually exclusive narratives and legitimacies to mutually inclusive and interdependent realities, replacing the lethal relationship of occupy and occupied, the dance macabre, as we said, with a very constructive attitude of good neighborly relations. But the last 7 years, however, have been suicidal in more ways than one, literally suicidal, but suicidal for both peoples. Both realities are unraveling, of course, Palestinian realities more than others. And the walls of hostility and distrust have been erected, as well as the physical ugly wall that we are seeing. Violence and extremism have prevailed. Now, the failure of the Oslo process, or the DOP, represented also a failure of vision, a failure of will, a failure of moral fiber. With the occupation on the rampage without any kind of accountability or positive intervention or curbs, and of course with the Palestinians deprived of any type of protection. We can discuss later all the reasons for the failure of the process, but basically it became a process for its own sake. Rather than a means to an end, it became an end unto itself. It lost its substance, its validity, it lost its relationship to reality. It did not influence behavior on the ground. And therefore, it was weakened systematically, and those who adhered to the peace process were weakened along with it. It did not provide any kind of restraints in terms of behavior. People were saying, we lost more land with the peace process than before. More lives were lost with the peace process than before. More settlements were being built. So the peace process had a life of its own that was totally abstracted and separate from reality, and reality on the ground proceeded in ways that contradicted the very essence of the requirements of peace. And this is one reason why we have the rise of Hamas and other ideologies in Palestine. Now, there are many reasons people are asking me, why did Hamas gain such numbers and votes? There are internal and external reasons, and again, this is something we can discuss later, whether it is in reaction to the PA corruption and ineptitude, and the Fatah corruption and sense of entitlement. This is very clear. There has been a criticism. And I personally was, founder of many, I have to correct my introduction. founder of many reform committees, whether national committees or civil society committees or coalitions like Amman and so on. But this is something that Palestinian people reacted to. They do not take kindly to corruption. They do not accept. They have not internalized corruption. All our studies shows that the Palestinians despise corrupt people. And one reason why Hamas was elected was the corruption. And they ran on a platform of change and reform. But they also had money, they also had weapons, and so they had other sort of artificial sources of power. And again, the rise of unilateralism and extremism and violence in Israel and ideology gave rise to their counterparts in Palestine. The lack of any kind, any prospect for peace also gave rise to more militant ideologies in Palestine. And therefore, and of course with the siege and so on, and the incursions and the settlements, Hamas got the revenge vote, the angry vote, the protest vote, the despair vote, in addition to the ideological vote and the support vote. Right now, if you look at the public opinion, this has shifted, but still, this is a transformation in terms of external realities and internal realities producing a political shift in Palestine. The disempowerment and the letdown of the nationalist and secular factions and currents, led by, of course, the PLO and Fatah, led to the vindication of the Islamic response and the ideological agenda versus the agenda of national self-determination. And the same thing in Israel, you have even more extreme, the messianic ideology, particularly of the settlers, that are pulling back the discourse into anachronistic and absolutist dimensions. On both sides, the systematic rejection of the other and the negation of partnership and the revival of labels and stereotypes and racism and so on, and attempts to delegitimize the other or the adversary, has led to a new phase of dehumanization and justification of atrocities and violence. The revival of existential distrust and the misreading of motives has led to two things. In Israel, of course, they are talking about Palestinian irredentism, that Palestinians still want to destroy Israel by demographic means and other means. And in Palestine, public opinion feels that Israel is completing the war of 1948 and the ethnic cleansing of Palestine and the total destruction of Palestine, where they will annex the land without the people and we become population centers, isolated, under siege, dissolving and destroying the national components. That's why I call it the deconstruction of Palestine. So in 2006, when we had our elections and Hamas got the majority vote, we could say they were technically free and fair elections. There was no intimidation, there were no flaws, there was no fraud. Still, the elections were tainted by the occupation, by the measures and the atmosphere of occupation. This is why we're saying it's very hard to talk about normal conditions in an abnormal setting and atmosphere. You have a traumatized people with a sense of victimization, with a sense of pain, being motivated to vote in ways that would affect the outcome of the vote. And therefore, the occupation did affect the outcome. And of course, there was another negative intervention in terms of the boycott and sanctions exercised against not just Hamas, but the Palestinian people. Ironically, we found ourselves, as a people under occupation, being subject to international sanctions and boycott, when for decades we've been saying Israel has been violating international law, international humanitarian law, and everybody said, don't even dream of sanctions against Israel or any type of boycott.